Hey guys, it's later and kind of dark, so I apologize if the lighting is crap, but chances are you're probably just listening to this with your eyes closed anyway. I probably would be. Anywho, Homecoming by Cynthia Voigt, Chapter 3, Part 2, or Part 2, Chapter 3. When Daisy awoke, she was cool and damp and even a little chilly. The morning air lay moist above her. She turned her eyes from the gray sky to her family. Sammy wasn't there. She sat up, peering towards the bush they used for a bathroom. She waited long enough, she judged, but he did not appear. She jumped to her feet and looked around. His little figure sat huddled on the bulkheading at the end of the lawn. In the mists rising from the water, he could have been a woeful little bush planted between the willow and the pine. Dacey went to the bathroom, then walked down to join him. He knew who she was without turning his head. "What got you up?" she asked. "I had to pee," he said. His fingers picked long splinters from the wood. "I was thinking," he said. "You worried?" He shook his head. "I'm not scared of sailing." "I never said you were," Dicey answered. "You're not scared of anything, are you?" Sammy looked at her then, his eyes questioning. "I had a dream that you were all on a bus, and the door closed, and I couldn't get on. I ran and ran after it, but it kept getting away." Dicey nodded her head and watched the mists rising in straight lines, like rain going backwards. In the east, the sky lightened. "Dicey, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Tell the truth." "I always do." "No, you don't," Sammy said. Dicey understood him. "I'll tell the truth, Sammy, I promise." Sammy asked his question. "Why were you going to go alone before James caught you?" The hulls of the boats were shadowy silhouettes on the water. Mist caught in the branches of the trees across the river. The mists would burn off, Dicey thought. There wasn't much wind. "I don't know what we're going to find when we get there," Dicey said, "so I figured if I went down alone and saw what it's like, then I could come back and get you all. If it was okay. If it wasn't okay, I could just forget about it. Also, I had enough money to get there and back on a bus and stay on my own in a hotel. See, Sammy, I don't know what this grandmother will be like. I was trying to make things easiest for you all. Do you understand?" "I guess so. I think so. Like I fight when people say things so they won't say them anymore." "Are you sorry that we're with you?" "A little, yes. It's harder with four of us, and more expensive, and since Stacy had determined to tell the whole truth, she did. And I kind of liked the idea of traveling alone, with no one to look after. But I was wrong, Sammy, or at least I think now I was. I made a mistake not telling you." "Why?" "Because we do things together. The trouble was we didn't do things together at Cousin Eunice's, and that got me thinking the wrong way." "How can something get you thinking the wrong way if you know how to think the right way?" Sammy asked. But he was sitting up straighter and kicking his heels. "They just do. I don't know. I always thought, well, you didn't make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes." "Not you. You didn't." "Oh, Sammy, I made dozens of mistakes." "Name one." "Staying too long at Rockland, not planning how to cross the Connecticut River, not having any money in New Haven, not telling Cousin Eunice what I thought about you and Maybeth." "Don't tell me," Sammy begged. "Don't tell me any more." "But you asked me to," Dicey protested. The sun was rising, turning the sky and air a rosy gold color. Gulls wheeled through the air. A boat motored quietly down the river, the people on it dark figures. "You did," Dicey insisted. "You did ask me." She reached over and tickled Sammy under his arm. He squirmed. She reached her other arm over, and wrestled him down to the grass, tickling, crying. "You did, you did, you did. Say so." Sammy screamed with laughter and wriggled under her hands. "All right, I did." Dacey stood up. She brushed her hands briskly together. "Let's get going," she said. They raced back up the lawn. They were early down to the boat, early and hungry. James grumbled that he wanted breakfast, but Dicey ignored him. She didn't want to spend any money until they got across the bay. She wanted everything to stay just as it was until they were actually on the other side. The Tillermans sat on the end of the dock waiting. All around them the boatyards came awake. Water traffic made many little waves. A slight breeze blew now, and little boats sailed down to the mouth of the river and the bay. Time passed slowly. Dacey sensed that it was after 8 o'clock. Cars streamed over the bridge, going towards town. People going to work, she thought. Her hunger mounted. She had been sure at first that she could wait to eat until they were across. "Tonight," Dacey announced, "we've got to wash our underwear and put on clean. Maybe shirts, too. Okay?" "Do you think they forgot?" James asked. His head moved restlessly. "Or changed their minds?" "Maybe," Dicey said. "Or they could have been lying to us." At this, James smiled. "That would serve us right, wouldn't it?" They had to eat. If Dicey was hungry, James must be starving. She went back to a gas station and bought crackers with peanut butter from a machine. Then she put in 2 more quarters and got chocolate bars. When she returned, the 2 boys were there, busy working with sails on the deck. They were dressed just as they had been the day before. Dicey wondered if they slept in their swimming suits. She looked at James and raised her eyebrows. She handed out packets of crackers and offered some of hers to Jerry and Tom. "No thanks," they both said. "We just ate. You kids stay in the cockpit, okay?" It was like sitting in a booth without a table with the 4 Tillermans, 2 to a side, knees hitting knees, stiff and watchful. The boys spent a long time putting on the jib. Jerry came back and stood by the base of the mast. He pulled down on a rope. The jib rose slowly and hung flapping at its stay. Jerry told Tom to fend off from the bow while he backed out of the dock. When Jerry returned to the cockpit, he looked at the Tillermans. "Ready to go?" "You bet," Dicey answered. "Drop your bag on one of the bunks below," Jerry told her. "Then I think you and your brother James had better go sit out on the cabin. I need room for play on the tiller. And Tom will be back here handling the sails. You ever sail before?" Dicey thought of lying and then thought better of it. "No," she said. Jerry considered this. His face was thin and his hair was bleached to a metallic tone that matched the gold in his eyes. His mouth looked soft and sulky, but his body was lean. "Okay," he said. "Listen carefully. We're going to have to tack out a ways, then we can reach over to St. Mike's. Tacking means we zigzag, getting as close to the wind as possible." His hand sketched a zigzag motion in the air. "At the end of each tack, I'll call, 'Ready about.' The boat will rotate about 60 degrees, and the mainsail and boom will swing from one side to the other. The heel will reverse, too." "What?" James said. "I don't understand." Jerry held out his hand stiffly, slanted one way, then reversed the slant. "That's what the keel does when we tack and come about," he said. "On a reach, we'll ride pretty flat. All you have to do is hang on when we come about. There's no danger. I want you to sit where you're put and sit quiet. But if I tell you to move or give any order, you've got to obey right away. Get that?" "We can do that," Dicey said. "All of us." She leaned down and tossed her bag onto a bunk below. Then she and James went forward to sit on the roof of the cabin. They could lean back against the mast or slip down to the deck and lean against the cabin wall. Jerry started the motor. Tom uncleated a heavy line with a floater tied on its end and dropped it into the water. James looked at Dicey. "I hope they know what they're doing," he said. The sun was toasting warm. The water danced beneath the keel. The motor hummed. The boat slipped out into the river and turned east. The jib flapped. Waterfront buildings glided slowly by. Boatyards, condominiums with great glass windows looking out over the water, an occasional small house in the middle of a green lawn. Theirs was one of many boats headed out to the bay. The motor stopped. Dicey turned her head. She smiled to Sammy and Maybeth, sitting straight up and still, one on each side of the cockpit. Tom stood up, holding the tiller. Jerry jumped up behind them to raise the mainsail. When he had it cleated, he jumped down into the cockpit and hauled in on a line. The mainsail stiffened, then puffed out. The boat responded, surging forward underneath them. Tom returned the tiller to Jerry and pulled in the jib. It was not the kind of jib Dicey knew. At Provincetown, she had seen little, narrow, triangular sails. This jib was long. It curved back around, halfway down the length of the cockpit. Dicey turned her head back and yelled, "What kind of a jib is that?" It's a Genoa," Tom answered. He seemed to be enjoying himself. His eyes squinted into the sunlight, and his smile showed big, square teeth. The wind blew firmly against the sails. The water jostled the boat, wave after wave. When Dicey looked at the water, they seemed to be traveling quite fast. But when she looked at the shore, now falling away behind them, they seemed to be going very slowly. Under the protection of the shore, the boat heeled only slightly. Jerry brought the boat about, and Dicey and James had to do no more than protect themselves from the Genoa as it flapped across the bow in front of them. Dicey saw a shadow of shoreline across the bay. She also saw 3 huge tankers, moored one behind the other, lying across their path like tall buildings. Jerry approached them, passed them, then passed between the two, where there was much more room than there had first seemed to be. The metal walls soared up above the little boat. Some crewmen waved down at them, and Dicey waved back. The tanker came from Athens across the Atlantic and down the length of the Mediterranean Sea. Dicey looked up the bay to where Baltimore was. 2 bridges, twin spans, crossed the bay in long arcs. They looked like something from the future. Slender silver ropes flung over the broad water, beautiful and strong. Dicey's eyes moved out, across again. Jerry brought the boat about, and after shifting her weight to compensate for the heel, she found she could no longer see the far shore for which they were headed. They had left most of the other boats behind, and now passed only an occasional fishing boat rocking at the end of its anchor line. The wind hummed in her ears. The sun poured over her face and arms and legs. The waves knocked against the keel, and the boat pulled forward. Like everything else in Annapolis, the movement was both lazy and fast at once. She turned back and saw Sammy staring at Tom. Jerry sat with the long wooden tiller in his hand, his eyes on the sails. Daisy slid down onto the deck and leaned her back against the cabin. The sky was clear, the sails shone white against it. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, Daisy felt part of the boat itself, riding the wind over the water. It was easy work, this. It was silent and serene. Her thoughts loosed themselves from their everyday moorings and wandered. Nothing mattered out here. Nobody talked and nobody listened. The waves went past them, maybe each different, maybe the same wave over and over again. Who knew which? Who cared? Daisy opened her eyes. They had never sailed in Provincetown. They'd never been asked. She had rowed in dinghies and been out once or twice on large fishing boats, but they were nothing like this quiet harnessing of wind and the sharp keel cutting through the silken water. Out here there was salt on the wind itself that fell on your skin like rain. You could taste it. Out here the sun heated and the wind cooled and the waves sang their constant song. Daisy wished she could stop breathing and give herself entirely over to the movement and the being still. Maybe she could learn to sail. Maybe she could go to sea somehow. A boat could be a home. The perfect home that could move around, a home that didn't close you in or tie you down, and a sailor would always be at home if he was on the sea. Maybe life was like a sea, and all the people were like boats. There were big, important yachts, and little rafts, and motorboats, and sailboats, and working boats, and pleasure boats. And some really big boats like ocean liners or tankers. Those would be rich or powerful people, whose lives engulfed many other lives and carried them along. Or maybe each boat was kind of a family. Then what kind of boat would the Tillermans be? A little one, bobbling about with the mast fallen off? A grubby, worn-down workboat with Dicey hanging onto the rudder for dear life? Everybody who was born was cast onto the sea. Winds would blow them in all directions. Tides would rise and turn in their own rhythm. And the boats, they just went along as best they could, trying to find a harbor. Daisy didn't feel like finding a harbor. She knew she needed one, and they needed one, but she would rather just sail along dreaming, not caring where they were going or when they would get there or what they would do there. Couldn't you live your whole life without going into harbor? The land would catch you at the end. Home is the sailor. But until then, you could keep free. And even then, even when you died, you could die at sea, and your body would roll with the underwater currents until your flesh peeled off and you were white bones rocking in the waves on the sandy bottom of the ocean, always part of the changing. Daisy smiled to herself. The ocean at Provincetown had always sung at her, too. As long as I'm near the water, she thought, that'll be enough, even if I'm on land. Because life wasn't really an ocean, and she wasn't really a little boat bobbling about on it. There were James and Maybeth and Sammy, for one thing. But for now, she was content to sit still and silent. The sun beat down hotter, and her skin started to run with sweat. She was getting sticky, uncomfortable. The sails fell lifeless and quiet, flapping morosely. The boat no longer thrust ahead, slicing the waves. Now it rolled from side to side. She crawled back over the cabin. "What's the matter?" she asked. The two boys were leaning back, drinking beer from cans. "Wind's died down," Tom said. "That happens," Jerry added, "especially in the middle of the bay. No worry. The only deadline we have is I've got to be back in Annapolis by dark." "Yeah, or the ghosties and boogies will get him." Jerry frowned but ignored his friend. "We can always let you off and head right back." "I've got some friends in St. Mike's," Tom said. "We know about your friends in St. Mike's," Jerry answered. "It beats sitting around watching TV," Tom answered, "doesn't it? Your mom's not here, Jerry. You can tell the truth." Daisy interrupted. "Could I steer? I mean, we're not going anywhere." "We are, but not far." "Go ahead. Let her," Tom urged. Jerry agreed. Jerry slid down toward Sammy and put Daisy's hand on the long tiller. The wood was smooth and warm. It responded to every vibration in the hull and every flapping of the sails. Daisy's hand seesawed gently back and forth. The tiller let her feel the boat under her hand. She grinned at Jerry. "I like it," she said. He grinned back at her and taught her how to head up into the wind and point down away from it. He showed her what changes in the mainsail to watch for. He pointed to the glassy water just ahead of them, and then to a patch far ahead where little ripples danced in the sunlight. "There's wind up there," he said. He leaned back and drank from his can of beer. I'm going below for a snooze, Tom announced. He climbed down the ladder and disappeared. Sammy went up to sit with James. Jerry moved over to Tom's seat. He doesn't like sailing, he said. Ooh, Sammy? I didn't notice. No, Tom. But he's got nothing better to do, Jerry shrugged, then smiled a little. And he likes getting me into trouble. What about you? Dicey asked. I need some help getting in trouble. I'd never dare do it on my own, you know. Rebellion is necessary for the development of character. Dicey wondered about that. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation, Jerry said. Somebody said that. He was right. So I get in trouble now and then, so I won't be like most men. You're going to leave a life of noisy desperation? Dicey asked. He laughed at that. He gave himself over to laughter and enjoyed it. Dicey decided she liked him after all. At least that much, he said. More if I can, but at least that. They sailed on, if this odd rolling process could be called sailing. Then under her hand, Dicey felt the boat stir. She looked at the water and the sails. They had reached the Ripley patch of water. The sails bellied out. Jerry was watching her. She offered him the tiller, but he shook his head. His smile teased her. He pulled in on the Genoa line and held it. The long sail lay nearly flat. The mainsail line he had already cleated down. Watch the Genoa, he instructed. Dicey did. She watched the sail and the water ahead. She rested her hand lightly on the tiller, letting the boat tell her where it wanted to go. She sat alert, her body tuned to that gentle pull on the tiller. Boat, waves, water, and wind. Through the wood, she felt them working for her. She was not directing, but accompanying them, turning them to her use. She didn't work against them, but with them, and she made the boat do that too. It wasn't power she felt guiding the tiller, but purpose. She could not stop smiling. The wind built up, and Jerry took back the tiller, giving Dicey the Genoa line. She played it without being told, letting it out a fraction, pulling it in 2 fractions, responding to the pull of the wind in the sail. They didn't talk, sailing the boat. They didn't talk at all until Jerry pointed out the land approaching. Dicey saw short, narrow beaches, a few trees, some big houses. Another hour, Jerry said. Dicey nodded. How old are you? He asked. 13, Dicey answered. I turned 13 in June. That's too bad, Jerry said. If you were 15, or even 14. You really take to it, don't you? I've never seen anybody take to it like that. I never thought a girl could. You've got good hands, Dicey, and you're not scared. 13 isn't too young to sail, Dicey pointed out. No, it isn't, he agreed. He leaned his head down and called Tom awake. We've got to come about and make the approach to St. Mike's. Dicey nodded to show she understood, and she thought she did understand what he had said. She was too young to be a girlfriend. Her cheeks grew warm with the thought. Of course she was, much too young, and besides, she had more important things to do. She was surprised at herself, though, for the nice feeling it gave her. Maybe because she'd been so often taken for a boy. She joined James and Sammy. Maybeth said she didn't want to move from her seat nestled up against the cabin wall, where she had sat silent for the whole trip, so Dicey returned to the foredeck. The boat heeled a little now in the afternoon wind. She and James kept Sammy sitting between them. I sailed it, Dicey said. I saw, James answered. What was it like? Dicey couldn't explain. Great, she said. They watched the shoreline close in, then, as Jerry negotiated the channel into St. Mike's. This was lowland, with large houses standing on bright green lawns. Buoys slipped by. Jerry let down the mainsail and gathered it in, wrapping it around the boom and looping a line around to hold it. Tom turned on the motor. Jerry loosed the Genoa halyard and showed Dicey how to pull it down and hold it in at the same time. Great armloads of material surrounded her. She couldn't see anything. Jerry's voice, muffled by the sail he was packing into a sail bag, assured her that she was doing just fine. They pulled into the front of a long dock, and Tom took a line from the bow and wrapped it around one of the posts. Jerry tied the stern. He held the boat close to the dock while the Tillermans climbed out. The steadiness of the land under her feet felt strange to Dicey. She felt as if everything was reversed. On the boat, the deck had been unsteady, and her leg muscles had worked to keep her balanced. On land, the ground was so steady that her leg muscles took up the motion of the boat. It was crazy. Her family stood back while she thanked Jerry. Tom was talking to him about calling some people. We got beer on the boat, he was saying. Jerry hesitated. Just an hour. You can call your old lady and tell her where you are if you're worried. Or better yet, call her and tell her you're here and you can't get back before dark. She'll be all mad at you for sailing over, but glad you called, so it'll be all right, Jerry. You wanna? Man, we're over here with the boat and beer. We can really have a party. Jerry laughed, a light, high sound. He turned the idea over in his mind. I don't know, he said. Dicey knew. She knew also what he would decide. We gotta find a bus, she said. Thanks an awful lot. That's okay, kid, Tom answered. Dicey waited for Jerry to say something. Finally, he noticed. It was fun, he said. Yeah, it was. It really was. See you around, yeah? He said. Probably not, Dicey said. She held out her hand and he shook it. Yeah, he said, but he wasn't paying attention to her. He was looking at Tom and a smile was creeping over his mouth. Dicey picked up her bag, slung it over her shoulder, took a last look at the boat, and walked off fast. St. Michael's was a small town huddled around its waterfront. It was like Annapolis, but without the hurrying quality of the city across the bay. It was pretty, but Dicey was not cheered by that as they walked out of town on the one main street. She felt vaguely sad. To make herself feel better, she vowed that she would sail again, and often, if she could. Crisfield was on the water. People there must sail. The mid-afternoon sun pounded down on them. They walked two abreast on the side of the road, Dicey with Maybeth, James with Sammy. Dicey carried her bag over her shoulder. Little townhouses with handkerchief lawns gave way to fields where corn and soybeans grew. Driveways led off the highway. Sometimes you could see the roofs of houses back among the trees that began at the far ends of the fields. Some of the mailboxes had the names of houses on them. Windward, Peterson's Landing, Oakwood, Second Chance. They came to a wooded section, mostly pines, and walked at its edge, as far from the traffic as they could get. In the midst of this section, a driveway went off. Like the other driveways they'd passed, this was a dirt road, but this road had a name, Overview Circle, and a bunch of mailboxes clustered at its beginning. Dicey peered down the highway and saw a small store ahead with a gas pump out front. You all wait here, she said, putting down her bag. I'm going up to the store to get some food, and we'll see if there's a place to camp down this driveway. I figure these are big estates, and probably on the riverfront, okay? It's not dark yet, James objected. It's getting late and we've got to find a place. This looks like there might be lots of privacy, Dicey explained. Okay, if you say so, James said. And if I'm wrong, there'll still be time to find another place, Dicey said. They sat down within the first row of trees. Dicey walked on, scuffling her feet, to the store. Dicey entered the store through the screen door. She saw mostly cans and dried foods. There was one small icebox that held milk, butter, eggs, and cold cuts in plastic packaging. She picked out a can of chicken noodle soup, a quart of milk, a loaf of bread, a bar of soap, a box of safety matches, and 4 tomatoes from a bushel basket. It cost $2.10. Money back then, it went a long way. The storekeeper stood beside her while she made all these selections, watching her carefully. He didn't say a word. He was a bony man with short grizzled hair and long nervous fingers. When Dicey had piled everything on the counter, he said, "That be it?" and rang up her purchases on an ancient cash register. Something about his voice was familiar, but Dicey couldn't put her finger on it. Outside, Dicey recognized what had been familiar in the man's voice. He had Mama's way with the sounds of letters. They sounded, just a little, like Mama. Dicey smiled and rejoined her family. The dirt driveway led off the road straight for a quarter of a mile before it began winding among the trees. At the turns, driveways entered. Dicey walked down one and saw a large house, white shingled, and water beyond it. Dogs barked at her, so she turned back. The third house was silent, although a car waited in the long garage. The Tillermans skirted the trees at the edge of the property and cut down to the water when they saw it. They found a marshy beach, nestled back against the piney woods. It was not ideal, but it was private, and except for the birds and frogs, quiet. Dicey built a small fire and opened the soup can with her jackknife can opener. It was hard work, but it did the job. She mixed a can of milk into the condensed soup in the pan. Then she told everybody to strip and put on clean underwear. James stood in the muddy water and washed out their underwear using the cake of soap. He brought it back for Dicey to inspect. I don't know, she said. The water's muddy, not like a laundromat. Maybeth spread the wet clothing over some bushes. They sat around the small fire and took turns drinking soup from the pan, soaking it up with flabby slices of bread. They passed the milk container around, and Dicey halved the tomatoes. They ate these eagerly, even Sammy, who didn't ordinarily like tomatoes. They were red, firm, juicy. They tasted fresher than anything Dicey had ever eaten before. After supper, Dicey put out the fire. We don't want to attract attention, and set Sammy fishing in the quiet river. After a while, James joined Sammy, holding his own line and hook. The sun set quietly, flaming in the water. The boys caught 5 small fish, which they killed and then left lying in the water so they'd be fresh for breakfast. When the sun was only a band of burning red seen through the trees, Dicey took out the ponchos and spread them on the ground, rolling on them to crush the undergrowth beneath. Nobody wanted to go to sleep, however. They sat with their knees pulled up under their chins. Maybeth began to sing, and they joined in without thinking. They kept their voices down just in case, but they sang eagerly. When darkness had fallen over everything and the stars burned bright in a moonless sky, they went to sleep. All right, guys. That was chapter 3 of part 2. I hope you're still enjoying. Please leave comments down below if you want to about anything you're enjoying in the book. If you have any questions or speculation as to what's going to happen, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. I'd appreciate both. And if you do subscribe, even if you haven't, even if you have already, I can read, but I can't speak. Even if you have subscribed already, but you've not clicked the bell icon, I suggest you do that, and that way you will always be informed when I upload new videos. Thank you so much for being so supportive of me and the channel and of this reading aloud series, because I'm really, really enjoying it, and I hope that you guys are too. I know I'm not getting a lot of hits, but you know what? Even if one person is enjoying what I'm doing, that makes me happy. So again, thanks for watching and listening, and have a great rest of your day or night, whatever time it may be. And I'll be back soon with more stuff. Bye, guys.